On an ordinary afternoon in the year 79 AD, thousands of people in a thriving Roman city looked up and watched the sky turn black in the middle of the day. Within 18 hours, an entire city would be gone, not looted, not burned to the ground, buried alive, sealed so completely that it would take almost 17 centuries before anyone found it again. Today, we're stepping into the final days of Pompeii, a bustling Roman town on the Bay of Naples that vanished beneath volcanic ash and stone in a single day. We're going to walk through what the evidence tells us about how people lived there, how they died, and how a mountain nobody feared turned out to be the deadliest thing in the Roman world. By the end, you'll understand why archaeologists still call this one of the most valuable disasters in human history. Pompeii sat near the base of Mount Vesuvius on the fertile volcanic soil of the Bay of Naples, land the Romans farmed for grapes and olives without fully understanding why it was so rich in the first place. The town had somewhere around 11 to 20,000 residents, a busy port nearby, paved streets with raised stepping stones for crossing after rain, public bathhouses fed by an aqueduct, taverns serving wine and hot food, a large amphitheater that could hold thousands of spectators, and walls covered with painted advertisements, election endorsements, and personal graffiti. It was not a sleepy backwater. It was a real, functioning Roman city with bakeries, brothels, workshops, and wealthy villas decorated with elaborate frescoes. And that's exactly why it makes it so valuable to us now. 17 years before the eruption that destroyed the city, a powerful earthquake had already struck the region in 62 AD, damaging buildings across Pompeii. Some structures were still under repair when Vesuvius finally erupted, scaffolding and construction materials still in place. Yet nobody connected that earthquake to the volcano looming above them. Vesuvius hadn't erupted violently in living memory. Its slopes were green and cultivated, and Roman writers of the period didn't even classify it as an active volcano. There was no warning system and no evacuation plan because, as far as anyone in Pompeii knew, the mountain was simply part of the landscape, not a threat sitting quietly above their homes. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. On August 24th, according to the traditional dating based on an ancient account, though some researchers now argue for a later date in October based on physical evidence like fallen fruit and heavier clothing found on victims, Vesuvius exploded with a force that sent debris more than 20 miles into the sky. The eruption comes down to us largely through a first-hand account written decades later by Pliny the Younger, who watched from across the bay and later described the ash cloud rising like an enormous pine tree, spreading out at the top the way that kind of tree branches. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, a naval commander and scholar, sailed toward the disaster to rescue people and to observe it up close. He never made it back. His death, apparently from a combination of toxic fumes and a pre-existing respiratory condition, is one of the only individually documented deaths from the entire eruption. For hours, Pompeii wasn't buried in lava at all. It was buried in pumice, light, porous volcanic rock that rained steadily down from the sky like a hailstorm that never let up. Roofs began to collapse under the accumulating weight. Streets filled ankle-deep, then knee-deep, then waist-deep with hot debris, forcing people to tie pillows or cushions over their heads for protection, a detail preserved in the archaeological record from objects found near some victims. Many residents used this early window to flee, grabbing coins, jewelry, and whatever valuables they could carry, and made it out of the city alive. The skeletons of those who escaped simply don't exist in the ruins because they weren't there when the worst part hit. What we're left with, then, are the stories of the people who waited too long or who had nowhere left to run. But here's the twist that changes the entire story. The pumice fall wasn't what killed most of the people who stayed behind. It was what came after. Sometime before dawn the next day, the eruption column became too heavy for the sky to sustain, and it collapsed in on itself. That collapse sent what volcanologists call a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving cloud of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments racing down the mountain at speeds that may have exceeded 100 miles an hour. Temperatures inside these surges are estimated to have reached several hundred degrees Celsius, hot enough to be fatal in seconds. For the people still sheltering in Pompeii, hoping through the long night that the worst had already passed, death came almost instantly. Research on the victims' skeletal remains, including unusual fractures and contorted postures, suggests many died from thermal shock and instant muscle contraction within moments, not from a slower death by suffocation, as was long assumed by earlier generations of researchers. It was, in the cruelest possible way, Quick, this is where Pompeii becomes something almost unheard of in archaeology. The ash that finally settled over the city didn't just destroy it, it preserved it. Because the fine ash hardened around organic material and then that material decayed away, it left cavities in the shape of the bodies that had been there. In the 1860s, an archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli realized these voids could be filled with plaster before excavation. The result was haunting, casts capturing the exact final positions of men, women, children, and even a chained dog, curled or reaching or shielding their faces at the moment they died. And the discoveries didn't stop with the bodies. Excavators found bakeries with loaves of bread still inside ovens, bars with price lists painted on the walls, gardens with root systems perfectly preserved by the same casting technique, and thousands of pieces of graffiti, everything from political endorsements to insults to declarations of love scratched into plaster. In one house, excavators found a half-eaten meal left on a table. In another, a strongbox full of coins that its owner never had the chance to grab. Pompeii gave historians something almost no other ancient site could. Not a monument built to impress the future, but an entire ordinary town caught mid-motion, mid-conversation, mid-day. Modern science has kept adding new layers to this story. DNA analyses on some of the plaster cast victims have revised long-standing assumptions, revealing, for instance, that a pair of remains once popularly described as a mother and daughter were not biologically related at all, and that a figure long assumed to be a woman clutching jewelry was, based on skeletal analysis, likely male. These findings are a useful reminder that even a site as thoroughly studied as Pompeii still gets reinterpreted as techniques improve, and that our first assumptions about the dead aren't always the correct ones.
Pompeii wasn't alone. The nearby seaside town of Herculaneum, smaller and closer to the volcano, was buried even more completely under successive waves of pyroclastic material that eventually hardened into rock as hard as concrete, in places burying the town under 60 feet of debris. For a long time, historians assumed Herculaneum's population had largely escaped by sea, because so few skeletons turned up within the town itself during early excavations. Then, starting in the 1980s, archaeologists working near the ancient shoreline uncovered hundreds of skeletons packed into a row of stone boat chambers. People who had run toward the water hoping for rescue and were caught there when the surges arrived. The evidence forced a grim revision of the story. Escape by boat had likely become impossible almost from the very beginning of the eruption, and the town's missing residents hadn't gotten away at all. Herculaneum also preserved something Pompeii largely didn't: organic material. The intense heat carbonized wood, food, and even furniture instead of destroying it outright. And in one villa, it carbonized an entire library of papyrus scrolls. For centuries, those scrolls were unreadable, blackened, and too fragile to unroll without crumbling. In recent years, researchers have started using X-ray scanning and machine learning to virtually unroll and read some of these scrolls without ever physically opening them, recovering fragments of ancient philosophical texts that hadn't been read by human eyes in nearly 2,000 years. It's a rare case where a disaster and modern technology, separated by 2 millennia, ended up working together to preserve knowledge instead of destroying it. For centuries, Pompeii's exact location was lost. It wasn't erased from memory so much as buried by geography, its name surviving in a handful of ancient texts, while its physical location slipped away under new farmland and vineyards, planted over the same rich volcanic soil that had doomed it in the first place. In the 1590s, workers digging a water channel stumbled across ancient walls and inscriptions bearing the city's name, but the discovery wasn't followed up. It took until 1748, under the sponsorship of the Bourbon King Charles III, for organized digging to begin at Pompeii, following earlier work that had already started uncovering Herculaneum a decade before. Early excavation techniques were crude by modern standards, more like treasure hunting than archaeology, and it wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that the methodical, careful science we associate with Pompeii today really took hold. That's what brings us to the real weight of this story. Pompeii's destruction was a tragedy, almost certainly killing somewhere in the range of 2,000 people within the city itself, based on the number of victims recovered so far, out of a much larger regional death toll that scholars still can't pin down precisely. But that same disaster is why we know so much about daily Roman life that would otherwise have vanished. Most ancient cities were rebuilt, reused, and stripped for materials over the centuries, erasing the ordinary details of how regular people actually lived. Pompeii was sealed in a single afternoon and left almost untouched until modern archaeology arrived with the tools and the patience to read it properly. The eruption of Vesuvius didn't just end a Roman city. It froze one mid-sentence, mid-meal, mid-argument scrawled on a wall. And in doing so, it left behind the closest thing we have to a time capsule of the ancient world. Not a monument the Romans built for us to remember them by, but a moment they never meant anyone to see.